The global architecture of modern government remains the most enduring monument of the ancient Roman world, shaping every nation today. Roman tradition traces the city back to 753 BCE, where twin brothers Romulus and Remus were abandoned in the Tiber and nursed by a she-wolf. This founding legend ends in fratricide. Romulus murdered his brother to seize solitary control and name the rising city after himself. The myth established a lasting Roman conviction. They believed ultimate authority was inherently tied to violence and total domination. Archaeological evidence suggests a more grounded origin, pushing the first settlements on this site back to roughly 1000 BCE. Long before the legends, 9 hilltop villages sat isolated and vulnerable along the banks of the Tiber River. These communities merged into a single node for defense, allowing them to collectively dominate the region's most lucrative trade routes. Rome was born from the brutal, pragmatic necessity of surviving a competitive environment rather than the grand design of war gods. The Forum's massive ruins demonstrate the scale of civic organization the city eventually reached, starting with the formal kingships of 753 BCE. Unlike the neighboring tribes, early Roman kingship functioned without a standard family bloodline or hereditary succession. Governance relied on the Senate, a council of 300 elite advisors who represented the most powerful families in the growing city. This system granted the Senate the power to select each new king, creating an early, functional prototype for institutional checks and balances. This first political iteration was an intellectual breakthrough, but it lacked the structural strength to survive a leader who refused to be balanced. The system finally broke under Tarquin the Proud, the 7th and last king of Rome. Tarquin governed through fear and execution, bypassing the Senate's authority to establish a personal, unchecked tyranny. The absolute collapse of order began when Tarquin's son committed a horrific, unprovoked assault against the noblewoman Lucretia. This personal violation convinced the elite families that a single man with total power was an immediate threat to every citizen's safety. The Tarquin family's behavior proved that absolute monarchy was no longer just a political flaw, but a danger to the city's existence. In 509 BCE, the Roman people and the Senate rose together and banished the kings from their territory forever. To prevent another tyrant, they invented the Republic, a system designed to make the concept of a single ruler impossible to recreate. The Republic mandated 2 consuls instead of 1, gave them strict 1-year limits, and granted each the power to veto their colleagues' actions. By making every decision subject to a cure's challenge, the Romans wove a permanent systemic suspicion of absolute power into their laws. The Curia, the Senate's brick meeting hall, stands as the physical center where this competitive, shared bureaucracy was managed for centuries. This model of distributed authority became the engine that allowed Rome to expand from a small hill town into a global superpower. The political patch held for generations as Roman armies conquered the Mediterranean and absorbed the riches of fallen kingdoms. Shared power cured the local disease of kings, but it faced an uncertain future.
Modern governments frequently use ancient Roman prototypes. Words like veto, Senate, and republic were engineered over 2,000 years ago to manage the mechanics of power. In the 8th century BCE, Rome existed as a collection of timber huts and a small trading post along the banks of the Tiber River. Later Romans created a dramatic origin story for this settlement. They claimed the city was founded by Romulus and Remus, twin brothers abandoned as infants and raised by a she-wolf. Modern historians view the story of Romulus killing his brother as a manufactured legend. It provided the city with a noble pedigree that obscured its slower, less glamorous archaeological reality. Setting the mythology aside, we are left with a question of political engineering. How did a small river town build a system capable of ruling the ancient world for 2,000 years? Rome's earliest government was a kingdom, ruled by a succession of 7 kings. These early rulers used the city's formative years to design and test the first versions of Roman civic institutions. One of those early developments was the Senate. This council was created to advise the king and represent the interests of the city's elite class. The monarchy reached a breaking point under the final king, Tarquin the Proud. Roman tradition records his reign as one of extreme cruelty and arrogance. In 509 BCE, a crime committed by the king's son triggered a unified revolt. Aristocrats and commoners joined forces to expel the royal family from the city permanently. This revolution established a core Roman principle: absolute power concentrated in a single person is an existential threat to the state. To prevent the return of a monarchy, the Romans invented the Republic. Built on divided authority, the absolute power of the kings was split. 2 elected councils acted as executives. They shared power, followed the Senate's advice, and were restricted to 1-year terms to prevent anyone from becoming too dominant. The initial design favored the wealthy patrician class, leaving the common people, the plebeians, without a voice in the government. For several centuries, the plebeians organized strikes and political protests to gain their own representatives and legal rights. This constant need for internal negotiation made the Republic highly adaptable. The system learned to balance competing social interests rather than shattering under the pressure of class conflict. The strength of this political machine was tested during the Gallic sack of Rome, which left much of the city in ruins. Because the state's authority was distributed through the Senate and elected offices, rather than tied to a single monarch, the government continued to function. This institutional redundancy allowed the Romans to organize a recovery and rebuild their city. Rome utilized this internal stability to expand its borders. By the 3rd century BCE, the Republic had conquered the entire Italian peninsula. While the physical ruins of the empire illustrates its scale, the most significant Roman export is less visible. The political framework of the Republic, the system of shared power and institutional checks, remains the blueprint for many of the world's modern governments today. In the ancient world, stability was almost exclusively achieved through the rule of a single king. When Rome banished its monarchy to try and govern itself, they were making a massive, unprecedented gamble. This created an immediate power vacuum. Without a monarch to enforce order and direct the defense of the state, the early Roman Republic was highly vulnerable to internal fracturing and external conquest. That vulnerability was tested in 390 BCE. An invading force of Gauls sacked the city, burning 90% of its structures to the ground. Even with their city in ruins, the Romans refused to surrender. They stayed, but they recognized that survival required a total overhaul of their society to prevent a catastrophe of this scale from ever happening again. They rebuilt their society around 2 shock-absorbing technologies: a balanced political government and a professional military machine. These dual systems would provide the structural foundation for their expansion over the next several centuries. If you walk through the ruins of the Roman Forum today, these standing columns serve as physical metaphors for the Republic's first major invention, a political architecture designed specifically to prevent the return of a king. To manage executive power, they created 2 consuls. These leaders were elected annually, ensuring that no single individual could hold authority for long. They balanced this further with the veto. Either consul could instantly block the actions of the other, forcing the 2 leaders to find a middle ground or remain at a standstill. Below the executives, the state faced centuries of internal class warfare. The wealthy patrician families held most of the power, while the working-class plebeians provided the labor and the soldiers. To prevent the state from fracturing, Rome created the tribunes. These were political offices specifically designed to represent and protect plebeian rights within the government. By institutionalizing this friction, Rome built a government that could bend under the pressure of internal conflict, rather than breaking apart. The second technology focused outward. The trauma of the Gaulish invasion proved that a part-time militia of farmers was no longer enough to guarantee Rome's security. Rome transitioned to an army of paid, professional soldiers. For these men, warfare was a lifelong career rather than a seasonal duty. This professionalism allowed for total standardization. Every soldier was outfitted with identical weapons and armor, which meant gear could be mass-produced and replaced with industrial efficiency. On the battlefield, they utilized tactical rotations. By cycling fresh troops into the front lines while a battle was still raging, the Romans could maintain a level of physical stamina that eventually exhausted any opponent. They also integrated specialized engineers directly into their ranks. This allowed the legions to construct massive siege ramps and fortifications while under active enemy fire. Rome treated warfare as an industrial, highly engineered process that could be continuously measured and optimized. By 300 BCE, the combination of internal political stability and this professionalized military allowed Rome to systematically absorb the various cultures of the Italian peninsula. The Republic was no longer a city trying to survive. It had become an efficient machine for expansion. A professional army requires a constant influx of wealth. To find it, Rome looked south to Sicily, a strategic island controlling key trade routes. But Sicily was already dominated by Carthage, the most powerful naval force in the Western Mediterranean. This sparked a series of 3 wars that would last 120 years. The conflict was a fight to determine which of these powers would control the Mediterranean world. Rome had engineered a system to dominate Italy. But to expand further, this military machine would now have to break a rival that controlled the sea. In 1460 BCE, Rome leveled the city-state of Carthage. With their only serious rival eliminated, the Romans became the undisputed masters of the Mediterranean. Victory brought immense spoils. Rome seized vast new territories across Spain and Sicily, flooding the capital with staggering amounts of silver and raw resources. Along with land and wealth, Rome absorbed the societies it conquered. Greek art, complex philosophy, and monumental architecture poured into the capital, creating a vibrant cultural golden age. But this total military triumph carried a fatal flaw. The extreme wealth and sudden territorial expansion placed an impossible strain on their traditional political machinery. This map shows how Rome expanded outward from a single dot into a sprawling territorial giant. The Roman Republic was strictly engineered to govern a small, localized city-state, and its administrative gears instantly jammed when forced to manage a massive empire. Watch how the resources consolidate on screen. The new wealth did not spread evenly. Instead, it pooled at the very top, allowing a few elites to buy up all the land and squeeze out ordinary citizens. Politicians who tried to introduce debt relief or distribute land to the poor were beaten to death in the streets by rival factions. The mechanics of democratic debate gave way to armed mobs and physical force. Rome had conquered the outside world, but its internal systems were beginning to collapse. With the Senate paralyzed by violence, the state could no longer govern effectively, leaving a massive power vacuum. Ordinary Romans stopped looking to politicians for stability. They turned to wealthy generals who could actually pay them and promise them land in exchange for loyalty. Julius Caesar was the inevitable product of this volatile, militarized landscape. Given command of legions in Gaul, covering modern-day France, Caesar spent years conquering territory. His campaigns made him independently wealthy and wildly popular with the common public. Back in the capital, traditional politicians watched his rising authority with panic. A collision between a paralyzed government and its most successful general was unavoidable. In 49 BCE, a frightened Senate issued a direct ultimatum. Caesar must disband his army and return to Rome strictly as a private citizen. Caesar refused. He marched his armed legions across the Rubicon River into Italy, committing a direct, irreversible act of treason. After years of brutal fighting to defeat his main political rival, Pompey, Caesar essentially discarded the old rulebook entirely. Declaring himself dictator for life, he bypassed traditional debate. He enacted massive public works and debt relief that measurably improved the daily lives of average citizens. By crossing the Rubicon, Caesar proved that the illusion of the old republic was dead. Whoever commanded the largest army now dictated the law. Caesar now held total, unchecked control over Rome. A faction of conservative senators, including men like Brutus and Cassius, watched his absolute rule with growing horror. They diagnosed the problem entirely wrong. They believed Caesar, the man, was the disease killing their democracy, failing to realize he was merely a symptom of a government that had already collapsed. In 44 BCE, these senators drew daggers on the Senate floor and assassinated him, thinking they could restore the old political order by sheer force. It completely backfired. Instead of restoring a healthy republic, the assassination instantly plunged the empire back into chaos and a devastating civil war. The true autopsy of Rome reveals a different timeline.
The Republic died decades before Caesar ever crossed a river, crushed by the extreme inequality and administrative strain triggered by the Punic Wars. When a political structure buckles under its own weight, removing a single figurehead cannot fix it. The man is gone, but the broken system remains.
In September of 9 AD, Governor Publius Quintilius Varus led 3 legions deep into the punishing, rain-soaked swamps of ancient Germany. Varus treated the march as a routine administrative tour, focused on imposing Roman taxation and legal systems on a population he viewed as subdued subjects. He marched his men in a long, highly vulnerable column, encumbered by a massive baggage train of civilians and supplies. He felt secure because he relied on a century of Rome's own arrogant propaganda regarding the nature of the Germanic people. Roman anxiety toward the north began during the Cimbrian War, when migrating tribes inflicted catastrophic defeats upon the Roman Republic. These early losses established a lasting perception of the Germanic tribes as a terrifying, chaotic horde of giant blonde-haired warriors. Decades later, Julius Caesar turned this cultural fear into official state narrative. During his campaigns in Gaul, Caesar described the tribes across the Rhine as primitive, semi-nomadic people who lived primarily on meat and milk. Caesar specifically claimed they possessed no professional governance. He wrote that leaders were elected only for the duration of a war, and that the tribes completely lacked the concept of private land ownership. Modern analysis characterizes this as a society in a state of ordered anarchy. The Romans believed the tribes only survived without formal political structure because land was abundant and the population was small. By defining the Germanic world as a chaotic vacuum, Rome ignored the reality of their adversary. They prepared for a simple administrative cleanup while walking into a sophisticated trap. The actual reality of the tribes was far more complex. Writing a century later, the historian Cornelius Tacitus observed a society that was rapidly evolving, making collective decisions in popular assemblies, and distinguishing between hereditary kings and generals chosen for bravery. This diagram shows a typical Germanic longhouse. These structures housed extended families and cattle under a single roof, separated by a drainage channel. During freezing winters, livestock body heat helped maintain survivable temperatures, making cattle the primary measure of wealth. While men were engaged in war, Germanic women served as the primary managers of the household and the agricultural cycle. Tacitus noted they were often revered as prophetic voices whose opinions carried significant weight. Their influence extended to the battlefield itself. Women followed the armies to the front lines to provide encouragement and to remind the warriors that defeat meant the certain enslavement of their wives and children. Rome believed it was policing a primitive mob. In reality, they faced a complex society bound by fierce communal survival, profound familial stakes, and a professionalized warrior ethos. That ethos was centered on the comitatus, a standing group of professional warriors who pledged absolute loyalty to a single chieftain. This bond created a new social class that superseded traditional family ties. Arminius, a prince of the Cherusci, understood this system perfectly. He had served in the Roman auxilia and achieved citizenship, giving him an intimate knowledge of Roman military doctrine and Governor Varus's personal temperament. While feigning loyalty to Rome, Arminius covertly organized a multi-tribe alliance. He brought together the Cherusci, the Bructeri, and the Marsi and Chatti into a unified force. He then lured Varus's column into the restricting, swampy terrain of Colchisi. Trapped in deep mud and dense forest, the Romans could not deploy their heavy infantry formations. Over 3 days of relentless ambush, the Germanic warriors annihilated the Roman force. Approximately 20,000 men were killed, the legionary eagles were taken as trophies, and Varus committed suicide to avoid capture. Modern excavations at Colchis confirm the massive scale of destruction. Archaeologists recovered over 6,000 Roman artifacts and discovered ritual pits containing human bones, proving the total eradication of the 3 legions. The Varus disaster instantly ended the era of Roman expansion under Augustus. The shock of the loss forced a complete reevaluation of Rome's northern ambitions. Emperor Tiberius followed Augustus's will, establishing the Rhine and Danube rivers as the empire's permanent defensive frontier. This effectively froze the development of the Germanic tribes.
Remaining outside the Mediterranean sphere, they avoided forced assimilation and maintained their cultural autonomy. Rome's retreat granted the tribes the isolation necessary to continue developing their own social and military structures, free from imperial oversight. Although politically isolated, the tribes were drawn into the Roman economic orbit. Chieftains siphoned off vast wealth through Roman subsidies, trade, and frontier raiding. This wealth allowed chieftains to sustain larger, permanent warrior retinues. The comitatus evolved from a temporary warband into a professionalized social class. In this system, a warrior's primary obligation was to his leader, who provided him with food, finely forged equipment, and elevated status. This relationship proved more durable than any Roman administrative system. By failing to conquer the tribes at Teutoburg, Rome allowed the comitatus system to mature. This new structure, where a professional warrior class exchanged military service for a share of a leader's vast wealth, became the blueprint for the feudal hierarchies that would dominate Europe for the next. The infamous burning of Rome in 410 AD is often presented as a story of pure, chaotic destruction. Popular history frequently portrays the Germanic tribes as mindless, savage hordes who crossed the borders to tear down classical civilization. The archaeological record suggests a more complex motivation. These groups were starving, desperate, and heavily armed families fleeing a collapsing environment in the north. Viewing this era as a mass demographic crisis rather than a simple conquest changes how we see the origins of Europe. We move past the story of a falling empire and begin to see the harsh survival strategies that shaped the modern West. To understand these people, we look to the pre-Roman Iron Age. When the elite-controlled bronze trade collapsed, the regional economy shifted to bog iron. Because this ore could be pulled from any local swamp by commoners, the monopoly of the upper classes vanished. This democratization of technology fostered a decentralized society, where power was held by local warrior assemblies rather than a central king. Their religion was a community-based faith practiced in sacred groves and marshes. At the center of this world was the Earth Mother, Nerthus. Her rituals were deeply tied to the land and the lakes, reflecting a people whose survival depended entirely on the whims of an unforgiving climate. The physical evidence of this relationship survives in the peat bogs of northern Germany. Hundreds of bog bodies have been recovered, their leathery features preserved for millennia by the acidic environment. Many of these individuals suffered a specific ritual sequence, the combination of hanging, throat-slitting, and blunt force trauma, known as a triple death. While early Roman historians dismissed these as executed criminals, the evidence suggests otherwise. These victims often had groomed hair and uncalloused hands, and were buried with valuable jewelry. They were members of the elite. The Germanic tribes viewed bogs as portals to the divine. Sinking a high-status individual into the marsh was a calculated sacrifice, a desperate attempt to buy the favor of the gods during times of famine or climatic instability. This local structure fractured once it collided with Roman wealth. As Germanic chieftains served as mercenaries on the frontier, they gained access to unprecedented resources. This wealth transformed temporary military commanders into professional warlords who maintained permanent, loyal retinues. To better interact with the Roman state, small tribes consolidated into massive superconfederations. By the 2nd century AD, an alliance of these groups pushed into Italy, forcing Emperor Marcus Aurelius to spend the final years of his life fighting a grueling defensive war on the Danubian frontier. These new confederations were trapped by their own success. The warlords required a constant flow of Roman subsidies or plunder to keep their warriors loyal. Without this wealth, their power would evaporate. Ultimately, this created an inescapable economic dependency. Germanic aggression was fueled by the need to sustain a new military class that could no longer survive on the traditional farming systems of the north. This animated map illustrates two existential shocks that hit the Germanic world in the 4th century. First, the late antiquity Little Ice Age saw plummeting temperatures and widespread crop failures across the north. At the same time, the Huns, a nomadic power from Central Asia, swept onto the European steppes, violently displacing everyone in their path. These dual pressures pushed tens of thousands of Goths toward the Roman border. They were physically pinned between the approaching Hunnic archers and the fortified line of the empire. In 376 AD, these refugees begged for asylum. The Roman failure to feed and integrate this massive population led to an immediate uprising. At the Battle of Adrianople, the starving, desperate migrants completely destroyed the Roman army and killed Emperor Valens himself. On New Year's Eve in 406 AD, this massive movement reached a breaking point. A coalition of entire tribal populations crossed the frozen Rhine near Mainz. These were folk wanderings, families moving their homes and property in a bid for survival. The eventual sacking of Rome was the result of this demographic crisis. The city was taken by hundreds of thousands of starving people who were responding to a total environmental and military collapse in their homelands. The deposition of the last Western emperor in 476 AD did not end Roman civilization. Instead, the conquering tribes worked to maintain the administrative and legal structures they found.
They wanted to participate in the wealth and order of the empire, not destroy it. The Franks emerged as the most powerful group by blending these worlds. King Clovis I converted to Catholicism to secure the support of the Gallo-Roman population, fusing his own warrior values with the existing authority of the Church. In Spain, the Visigothic Code abolished the legal distinctions between Goths and Romans. This new legal system even established property rights for married women, a significant development that moved beyond traditional Roman law. These barbarian kingdoms were sophisticated attempts to govern a new society by merging Roman institutional expertise with Germanic power. This conceptual merger defined the Middle Ages. The Germanic system of personal loyalty locks into the Roman system of institutional administration. This combination of personal allegiance and territorial law founded the feudal state system that would define the European continent. While the Eastern Emperor Justinian attempted to stop this transition through a brutal reconquest of Italy, the broader European synthesis proved too resilient to break. The cultural merger of the migrants and the Romans had already begun to take root. The modern Western world grew out of this adaptation. We live in a landscape shaped not by the survival of an invincible Roman Empire, but by the Germanic tribes who sought refuge within its borders and transformed it